Section 5 of The Adventures of Jimmy Skunk. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Leader. The Adventures of Jimmy Skunk by Thornton W. Burgess. Chapter 17. Jimmy Skunk Gets a Bump. Hardly had Jimmy Skunk entered the hole under Farmer Brown's henhouse, following close on the heels of Unc' Billy Possum, then along came Bowser the Hound, sniffing and sniffing in a way that made Unc' Billy nervous. When Bowser reached that hole, of course he smelled the tracks of Unc' Billy and Jimmy, and right away he became excited. He began to dig. Goodness, how he did make the dirt fly! All the time he whined with eagerness. Unc' Billy wasted no time in squeezing through a hole in the floor way over in one corner, a hole that Farmer Brown's boy had intended to nail a board over long before. Unc' Billy knew that Bowser couldn't get through that, even if he did manage to dig his way under the henhouse. Once through that and fairly in the henhouse, Unc' Billy drew a long breath. He felt safe for the time being anyway, and he didn't propose to worry over the future. Jimmy Skunk hurried after Unc' Billy. It wasn't fear that caused Jimmy to hurry. No, indeed, it wasn't fear. He had been startled by the unexpectedness of Bowser's appearance. It was this that had caused him to struggle to be first through that hole under the henhouse. But once through, he had felt a bit ashamed that he had been so undignified. He wasn't afraid of Bowser. He was sorely tempted to turn around and send Bowser about his business, as he knew he very well could, but he thought better of it. Besides, Unc' Billy was already through that hole in the floor, and Jimmy didn't for a minute forget what had brought him there. He had come for eggs, and so had Unc' Billy. It would never do to let Unc' Billy be alone up there for long, so Jimmy Skunk did what he very seldom does. Hurried. Yes, sir, he hurried after Unc' Billy Possum. He meant to make sure of his share of the eggs he was certain were up there. There was a row of nesting boxes along one side, close to the floor. Above these was another row, and above these a third row. Jimmy doesn't climb, but Unc' Billy is a famous climber. "I'll take these lower nests," said Jimmy, and lifted his tail in a way that made Unc' Billy nervous. "All right," replied Unc' Billy promptly. "All right, Brer Skunk. It's just as yo' say." With this, Unc' Billy scrambled up to the next row of nests. Jimmy grinned and started to look in the lower nests. He took his time about it, for that is Jimmy's way. There was nothing in the first one, and nothing in the second one, and nothing in the third one. This was disappointing, to say the least, and Jimmy began to move a little faster. Meanwhile, Unc' Billy had hurried from one nest to another in the second row with no better success. By the time Jimmy was halfway along his row, Unc' Billy had begun on the upper row, and the only eggs he had found were hard china nest eggs put there by Farmer Brown's boy to tempt the hens to lay in those particular nests. Disappointment was making Unc' Billy lose his temper. Each time he peeped in a nest and saw one of those china eggs, he hoped it was a real egg, and each time when he found it wasn't, he grew angrier. At last he so lost his temper that when he found another of those eggs, he angrily kicked it out of the nest. Now it happened that Jimmy Skunk was just underneath. Down fell that hard china egg squarely on Jimmy Skunk's head. For just a minute Jimmy saw stars. At least he thought he did. Then he saw the egg, and knew that Unc' Billy had knocked it down, and that it was this that had hit him. Jimmy was sore at heart because he had found no eggs, and now he had a bump on the head that also was sore. Jimmy Skunk lost his temper, a thing he rarely does. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. A sad, sad quarrel. Jimmy Skunk sat on the floor of Farmer Brown's henhouse, rubbing his head and glaring up at the upper row of nests with eyes red with anger. Of course it was dark in the henhouse, for it was night. But Jimmy could see in the dark, just as so many other little people who wear fur can. What he saw was the anxious-looking face of Unc' Billy Possum staring down at him. "You did that purposely," snapped Jimmy. "You did that purposely, and you needn't tell me you didn't." "On my honor, I didn't," protested Unc' Billy. "It was an accident, just a sure enough accident, and I'm right sorry for it." "That sounds very nice, but I don't believe a word of it. You did it purposely, and you can't make me believe anything else. You come down here and fight. I dare you to." Jimmy was getting more and more angry every minute. Unc' Billy began to grow angry. Of course, it was wholly his fault that that egg had fallen, but it wasn't his fault that Jimmy had happened to be just underneath. He hadn't known that Jimmy was there. He had apologized, and he felt that no one could do more than that. Jimmy Skunk had doubted his word, had refused to believe him, and that made him angry. His little eyes glowed with rage. "If yo' want to fight, come up here. I'll wait for yo' right where I am," he sputtered. This made Jimmy angrier than ever. He couldn't climb up there, and he knew that Unc' Billy knew it. Unc' Billy was perfectly safe in promising to wait for him. "You're a coward, just a plain no-account coward," snapped Jimmy. "I'm not going to climb up there, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait right down here until you come down, if it isn't until next year. Nobody can drop things on my head and not get paid back. I thought you were a friend, but now I know better." "Wait as long as you please. I reckons I can stay as long as yo' can," retorted Unc' Billy, grinding and snapping his teeth. "Suit yourself," retorted Jimmy. "I'm going to pay you up for that bump on my head or know the reason why." And so they kept on quarreling and calling each other names, for the time being quite forgetting that they were where they had no business to be, either of them. It really was dreadful. And it was all because both had been sadly disappointed. They had found no eggs where they had been sure they would find plenty. You see, Farmer Brown's boy had gathered every egg when he shut the biddies up for the night. Did you ever notice what a bad thing for the temper disappointment often is? End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. Jimmy Skunk is true to his word. Unc' Billy Possum was having a bad night of it. When he had grown tired of quarreling with Jimmy Skunk, he had tried to take a nap. He had tried first one nest and then another, but none just suited him. This was partly because he wasn't sleepy. He was hungry and not at all sleepy. He wished with all his heart that he hadn't foolishly yielded to that fit of temper which had resulted in kicking that china nest egg out of a nest and down on the head of Jimmy Skunk, making Jimmy so thoroughly angry. Unc' Billy had no intention of going down while Jimmy was there. He thought that Jimmy would soon grow tired of waiting and go away. So for quite a while Unc' Billy didn't worry. But as it began to get towards morning, he began to grow anxious. Unc' Billy had no desire to be found in that henhouse when Farmer Brown's boy came to feed the biddies. Then, too, he was hungry. He had counted on a good meal of eggs, and not one had he found. Now he wanted to get out to look for something else to eat, but he couldn't without facing Jimmy Skunk, and it was better to go hungry than to do that. Yes, Sir, it was a great deal better to go hungry. Several times when he thought Jimmy was asleep, he tried to steal down. He was just as careful not to make a sound as he could be, but every time Jimmy knew and was waiting for him. Unc' Billy wished that there was no such place as Farmer Brown's henhouse. He wished he had never thought of eggs. He wished many other foolish wishes, but most of all he wished that he hadn't lost his temper and kicked that egg down on Jimmy Skunk's head. When the first light stole in under the door and the biddies began to stir uneasily on their roosts, Unc' Billy's anxiety would allow him to keep still no longer. "Don't yo' think we uns better make up and get out of here, Brer Skunk?" he ventured.
"I don't mind staying here. It's very comfortable," replied Jimmy, looking up at Unc' Billy in a way that made him most uncomfortable. It was plain to see that Jimmy hadn't forgiven him. For some time Unc' Billy said no more, but he grew more and more restless. You see, he knew it would soon be time for Farmer Brown's boy to come to let the hens out and feed them. At last he ventured to speak again. "Ah reckons yo' done forget something," said he. "What is that?" asked Jimmy. "Ah reckons yo' done forget that it's most time for Farmer Brown's boy to come, and it won't do for we uns to be found in here," replied Unc' Billy. "I'm not worrying about Farmer Brown's boy. He can come as soon as he pleases," retorted Jimmy Skunk, and grinned. That sounded like boasting, but it wasn't. No, Sir, it wasn't, and Unc' Billy knew it. He knew that Jimmy meant it. Unc' Billy was in despair. He didn't dare stay, and he didn't dare go down and face Jimmy Skunk. And there he was. It certainly had been a bad night for Unc' Billy Possum. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20. Farmer Brown's Boy Arrives. The light crept farther down the door of Farmer Brown's henhouse, and by this time the hens were all awake. Furthermore, they had discovered Jimmy Skunk down below and were making a great fuss. They were cackling so that Unc' Billy was sure Farmer Brown's boy would soon hear them and hurry out to find out what the noise was all about. "If yo' would just get out of sight, Brer Skunk, I reckons those fool hens would keep quiet," Unc' Billy ventured. "I don't mind their noise. It doesn't trouble me a bit," replied Jimmy Skunk, and grinned. It was plain enough to Unc' Billy that Jimmy was enjoying the situation. But Unc' Billy wasn't. He was so anxious that he couldn't keep still. He paced back and forth along the shelf in front of the upper row of nests and tried to make up his mind whether it would be better to go down and face Jimmy Skunk or to try to hide under the hay in one of the nests. And all the time he kept listening and listening and listening for the footsteps of Farmer Brown's boy. At last he heard them, and he knew by the sound that Farmer Brown's boy was coming in a hurry. He had heard the noise of the hens and was coming to find out what it was all about. Unc' Billy hoped that now Jimmy Skunk would retreat through the hole in the floor and give him a chance to escape. "He's coming! Farmer Brown's boy is coming, Brer Skunk! You better get away while you can!" whispered Unc' Billy. "I hear him," replied Jimmy calmly. "I'm waiting for him to open the door for me to go out. It will be much easier than squeezing through that hole." Unc' Billy gasped. He knew, of course, that it was Jimmy Skunk's boast that he feared no one, but it was hard to believe that Jimmy really intended to face Farmer Brown's boy right in his own henhouse, where Jimmy had no business to be. He hoped that at last Jimmy's boldness would get him into trouble. Yes, he did. You see, that might give him a chance to slip away himself. Otherwise, he would be in a bad fix. The latch on the door rattled. Unc' Billy crept into one of the nests, but frightened as he was, he couldn't keep from peeping over the edge to see what would happen. The door swung open, letting in a flood of light. The hens stopped their noise. Farmer Brown's boy stood in the doorway and looked in. Jimmy Skunk lifted his big plume of a tail just a bit higher than usual, and calmly and without the least sign of being in a hurry, walked straight towards the open door. Of course, Farmer Brown's boy saw him at once. "So it's you, you black and white rascal!" he exclaimed. "I suppose you expect me to step out of your way, and I suppose I will do just that very thing. You are the most impudent and independent fellow of my acquaintance. That's what you are. You didn't get any eggs because I gathered all of them last night, and you didn't get a chicken because they were wise enough to stay on their roosts. So I don't know as I have any quarrel with you, and I'm sure I don't want any. Come along out of there, you rascal." Farmer Brown's boy stepped aside, and Jimmy Skunk calmly and without the least sign of hurry or worry walked out, stopped for a drink at the pan of water in the henyard, walked through the henyard gate,
and turned towards the stone wall along the edge of the Old Orchard. End of Chapter 20 and end of Section 5. Recording by John Leader, Bloomington, Illinois.